The annual charity gala at the Blackwood estate stood as a testament to New York's elite society. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across marble floors, while waiters in crisp black uniforms weaved through clusters of designer-clad guests. The main hall buzzed with the sounds of classical music and measured conversation, punctuated by the occasional tap of a champagne glass. Robert Morrison moved through the crowd with practiced ease, though his eyes betrayed a growing weariness. At 45, he had attended countless such events, each one blending into the next like watercolors in the rain. His tailored Tom Ford suit and perfectly trimmed salt and pepper hair marked him as one of their own, yet he felt increasingly like an observer rather than a participant. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the hall, announcing bids for a rare painting. 200,000 from the gentleman in blue. Do I hear 250? The routine display of wealth continued as Robert sidestepped another conversation about market projections and startup acquisitions. Near the grand staircase, a different scene unfolded. 3 young boys huddled together, their rented tuxedos slightly ill-fitting but clean. Among them, Jamal Washington stood out, his bright eyes taking in every detail of the opulent surroundings. At 10 years old, he had never seen anything like this outside of movies. "Go on, Jamal," whispered Marcus, one of his friends from the youth program that had secured their invitation to the event. "You're supposed to talk to rich people. That's why we're here." Jamal adjusted his borrowed bow tie, feeling the weight of expectation from his friends. Their presence at the gala was part of a community outreach program, meant to expose underprivileged youth to new opportunities. Yet while the other boys seemed content to sample the elaborate hors d'oeuvres, Jamal felt drawn to something else. He watched Robert from across the room, studying the way the businessman carried himself. There was something familiar in his stance, in the slight tilt of his head when he listened to others. It reminded Jamal of the few photographs he had seen of his father, pictures his mother kept in an old album but rarely showed him. The other guests seemed to orbit around Robert naturally, yet he maintained a certain distance. Jamal noticed how the man's smile never quite reached his eyes, how he would occasionally glance toward the exits as if planning an escape. It made him seem more approachable somehow, more human than the other adults who barely acknowledged the presence of the young guests. "I bet you can't even get close to him," challenged Marcus, misreading Jamal's hesitation as fear. Jamal straightened his shoulders. "Watch me." He began moving through the crowd, politely excusing himself as he had been taught. The closer he got to Robert, the more certain he felt about his decision to approach. Robert had just excused himself from another tedious conversation about cryptocurrency when he noticed the young boy approaching. Something in the child's determined expression caught his attention, making him pause rather than moving on to the next obligatory social interaction. Jamal stopped a few feet from Robert, suddenly aware of the height difference between them. But rather than feeling intimidated, he found himself studying the man's features more closely. The resemblance that had struck him from across the room was even more pronounced up close. "You look just like my rich dad," Jamal said, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess himself. His voice carried the clear, honest tone of youth, cutting through the artificial pleasantries that had dominated the evening. Robert blinked, caught off guard by both the approach and the statement. For the first time that evening, his smile reached his eyes. "Do I now?" he asked, genuinely intrigued by this unexpected interaction. The contrast between them was striking, the powerful tech magnate in his perfect suit and the young boy in his borrowed one, yet there was an immediate connection that transcended their obvious differences. Neither knew it yet, but this simple exchange would set in motion events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about family, wealth, and belonging. The conversation between Robert and Jamal moved to a quieter corner of the ballroom, away from the persistent buzz of auction bidding and social chatter. Robert found himself oddly comfortable talking with this forthright young boy, a stark contrast to the calculated interactions he'd endured all evening. "My mom used to work in a big house like this," Jamal said, his fingers tracing patterns on the polished marble windowsill. "She told me stories about it, but I thought she was making things up. No one has this many rooms." Robert leaned against the wall, his interest piqued. "What's your mother's name?" "Sarah Washington. She's an artist now, but she used to clean houses to pay for art school." Jamal spoke with unmistakable pride. "She paints these amazing pictures. Sometimes people even buy them at the community center." The name struck a chord in Robert's memory. Images flashed through his mind, a young woman with paint-stained fingers arranging flowers in his family's summer home, sketching in a notebook during her breaks. "Sarah Washington," he repeated slowly. Did she work on Long Island? At the Morrison estate? Jamal's eyes widened. That's it. She always talks about that place. Says it had the best light for painting. He studied Robert's face more carefully. Wait, do you know my mom? Robert felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. He remembered more now, Sarah's quiet presence in the house, her talent obvious even then. His mother had often commented on the young woman's artistic gift, though such discussions always ended abruptly when his father entered the room. I believe I do, Robert replied, choosing his words carefully. She worked for my family during summers about 15 years ago. I remember she always carried a sketchbook. She still does. Jamal exclaimed. Mom says she'll never be rich, but she's rich in her heart because she has her art. His voice dropped slightly. Sometimes when she thinks I'm sleeping, I hear her talking about someone she used to love. She says he was like a prince in a fairy tale, but their story didn't have a happy ending. Robert felt a strange chill despite the warmth of the room. He remembered whispered conversations, heated arguments between his parents about maintaining appropriate boundaries with the help. Sarah had disappeared suddenly one August, leaving behind only a half-finished sketch of the garden. Your mother is very talented, Robert said, steering the conversation to safer ground. I remember a portrait she did of our gardener. It captured his essence perfectly. Jamal beamed. She says art shows the truth inside people. That's why she loves it. He hesitated, then added, sometimes she looks at old pictures and gets sad. Especially this one fancy party picture. She's not in it, but she kept it anyway. The boy's casual revelations painted a picture that both intrigued and unsettled Robert. He found himself sharing stories from his own childhood, carefully selected memories of growing up in privilege, but focusing on universal experiences, scraped knees from climbing trees, getting caught sneaking cookies before dinner, the pressure of family expectations. Jamal listened intently, occasionally interjecting with similar stories from his own life in a very different part of the city. Despite the vast differences in their circumstances, their experiences shared surprising parallels, particularly regarding the weight of others' expectations. Mom says money doesn't make people better or worse, Jamal observed. Just gives them fancier problems. Robert laughed, genuinely impressed by the insight. Your mother sounds very wise. He glanced at his watch, surprised to find that nearly an hour had passed. I should probably make an appearance at the auction, but I'd like to learn more about your mother's art sometime. She sells paintings at the Webster Community Center every Saturday, Jamal offered eagerly. You should come see them. They're way better than the stuff they're selling here. As they prepared to part ways, Robert felt an inexplicable reluctance. Something about this chance encounter nagged at him, like a half-remembered dream. The boy's initial comment about resembling his father echoed in his mind, along with scattered memories of Sarah Washington and that long-ago summer. Thank you for the conversation, Jamal, he said formally, extending his hand. It's been the most interesting part of my evening. Jamal shook his hand with endearing seriousness. Thanks for not treating me like a kid. Most grown-ups here just pat my head and talk about how nice it is to help the poor. As Robert watched Jamal rejoin his friends, he pulled out his phone and made a note about the Webster Community Center. Something about this connection felt important, like a thread that, if pulled gently enough, might unravel a mystery he hadn't known existed. The Webster Community Center stood in stark contrast to the opulent gala venue. Robert parked his Tesla between aging sedans, the morning sun reflecting off broken glass in the parking lot. The art studio occupied a converted storage room on the second floor, marked by a hand-painted sign reading, Sarah Washington, Artist in Residence. Robert hesitated at the door, his usual confidence wavering. Through the glass panel, he could see canvases propped against walls and shelves cluttered with paint supplies. The space radiated creative energy despite its modest surroundings. Sarah looked up when he entered, her paintbrush freezing mid-stroke. She hadn't aged so much as evolved. Her face carried the same quiet strength he remembered, now etched with fine lines that spoke of both laughter and struggle. Paint stained her apron, and her hair was secured with a pencil in a messy bun. Mr. Morrison, she said quietly, carefully setting down her brush. Jamal mentioned you might stop by. Her tone was neutral, professional, but her hands betrayed her tension as they twisted a paint-stained rag. Please, call me Robert. He moved carefully through the studio, mindful of works in progress. Your son is remarkable. We had quite a conversation at the gala. Sarah's smile softened her guarded expression. He came home full of stories about meeting you. Said you reminded him of. She stopped abruptly, turning to rinse her brush with more attention than the task required. Robert found himself drawn to a large canvas near the window. The painting depicted the Morrison estate's garden, but not as it appeared in reality. The artist had captured something ethereal, morning light streaming through ancient oaks, dew glistening on roses. In the foreground, a young man stood with his back turned, his pose suggesting both belonging and exile. "You remember the garden," he said softly. "I painted everything that summer." Sarah moved to stand beside him, maintaining a careful distance. "Your grandfather loved watching me work. He said I saw beauty others missed." Robert's breath caught. "You painted Grandfather Morrison?" Sarah nodded, moving to a corner where several canvases leaned against the wall. She pulled out a smaller piece, blowing dust from the frame. The portrait showed an elderly man in a leather armchair, his sharp features softened by an enigmatic smile. Despite the painting's age, the old man's eyes seemed to pierce directly through Robert. "He was different from the rest," Sarah said, her voice taking on a distant quality. "He understood what it meant to love something more than money or status. We spent hours talking about art while I worked on this portrait." She paused, selecting her next words carefully. "He told me stories about his own past, about choices he regretted." Robert studied the portrait, seeing his grandfather with new eyes. "Father never mentioned you painted him. There's a lot your father never mentioned." Sarah's voice carried an edge of old pain. "Your grandfather commissioned several pieces that summer. He wanted to document the estate," he said, "but really." She trailed off, moving to adjust a student's easel. "Really what?" "He was documenting memories. Stories. Things he said needed to be preserved." Sarah picked up her brush again, adding texture to the canvas she'd been working on when Robert arrived. "The day before I left, he gave me an envelope. Said it contained truth that would matter someday." Robert felt the room tilt slightly. "What was in it?" Sarah's brush moved in steady strokes, her focus on the canvas absolute. "I never opened it. That night, your father made it clear my presence was no longer welcome. I left the envelope in my room when I packed. Some truths are better left buried." The implications hung heavy in the air. Robert remembered that time differently now, his father's increasing agitation, his grandfather's unusual interest in the young artist's work, heated arguments behind closed doors. "Jamal has your grandfather's eyes," Sarah said suddenly, then pressed her lips together as if regretting the words. Robert studied her profile, noting the tension in her jaw. "Sarah, why did you keep that photograph? The one from the party." She finally turned to face him fully, her expression a complex mix of defiance and vulnerability. "Some memories deserve witnesses, Mr. Morrison. Even if we can't speak them aloud." A door slammed somewhere in the building, making them both jump. The spell broke, and Sarah stepped back, professional distance falling into place like a shield. "Jamal's art class starts in 20 minutes, she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Was there something specific you wanted to discuss about the program?" Robert recognized the dismissal but couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just walked through a door that couldn't be closed again. "The portrait of my grandfather, is it for sale?" Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Some things aren't meant to be bought, Robert. Some truths can only be earned." As he left the studio, Robert's mind raced with implications and half-formed theories. His grandfather's portrait seemed to follow him with knowing eyes, and Sarah's careful words echoed with unspoken revelations. He pulled out his phone, sending a message to his assistant, "Find everything you can about Sarah Washington's employment at the Morrison estate, summer of 2009. And locate my grandfather's personal papers." Robert's private office occupied the entire top floor of Morrison Tech's Manhattan headquarters. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, but his attention was fixed on the man pacing before his desk. Alex Morrison, younger by 3 years, had inherited their father's sharp features and cutting demeanor. "Have you completely lost your mind?" Alex stopped pacing to plant both hands on Robert's desk. "You're spending time in community centers now? With the cleaning lady's kid?" Robert continued reviewing documents on his tablet, deliberately maintaining his composure. "Sarah Washington was more than a cleaning lady, as you well know. And Jamal is a remarkably bright young man. Oh, spare me the charitable outreach PR angle. Alex dropped into a leather chair, loosening his tie with agitated movements. The board is already questioning your focus after you diverted funds to that inner-city education initiative. Now you're personally mentoring some random kid from the projects. He's not random. Robert finally looked up, his voice carrying a sharp edge. And your elitism is showing, Alex. It's not a good look for our public image, considering father built this company with borrowed money and grandfather's construction worker wages. Alex's face flushed. Don't throw family history at me. Times have changed. We have a reputation to maintain, appearances to consider. What do you think people will say when they see a Morrison spending time in that neighborhood? They might say we remember where we came from. Robert stood, walking to the window. Below, the city stretched out like a maze of possibilities and barriers. Something's happening here, Alex. Something bigger than social status and boardroom politics. What's that supposed to mean? Robert turned back to his brother. Jamal mentioned something interesting about grandfather Morrison. Said Sarah used to paint his portrait. Did you know about that? Alex's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. Ancient history. The old man was always picking up strays, trying to prove he hadn't forgotten his humble origins. He straightened his tie, a nervous habit inherited from their father. What does any of this matter now? It matters because there are questions that need answers. Robert returned to his desk, pulling up a file on his computer. Did you know father doubled Sarah's final payment? Transferred a significant sum to her account the day she left, marked as settlement and considerations. Standard severance package, I'm sure. Alex's casual tone felt forced. Robert, you're the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar technology company. You don't have time to play detective over some decades-old staffing issue. Then why did grandfather change his will 2 days after Sarah left? And why did father fight so hard to keep those changes private? Alex stood abruptly. Stop digging. Please. His voice carried an unfamiliar note of desperation. Some doors should stay closed, Robert. For everyone's sake. What do you know, Alex? I know that father worked his entire life to elevate this family above its origins. To give us opportunities he never had. Alex moved toward the door, then paused. And I know that looking backward only leads to pain. Let the past stay buried. Like we buried grandfather's true legacy. Robert's words stopped Alex at the threshold. He tried to tell us something important that summer, Alex. Something about value and family and what really matters. What matters is protecting what we have. Alex's shoulders tensed. That boy and his mother. They're not part of our world. They can't be. The cost would be too high. The cost to whom? Alex turned, his expression haunted. To all of us. Trust me on this, brother. Walk away now, before you unveil things that can't be undone. As the door closed behind Alex, Robert opened his desk drawer, removing an old photograph. It showed the Morrison estate garden in full bloom, his grandfather seated on a stone bench. Behind him, barely visible in the background, stood a young woman with a paintbrush, capturing the scene on canvas. Her free hand rested protectively over her midsection, a gesture that now seemed heavy with meaning. Robert's phone buzzed with a message from his assistant, found the papers. There's something you need to see. He stared at the photograph for a long moment before reaching for his coat. The truth was waiting, and no amount of family pressure could stop him from finding it. Not anymore. Jamal stood in the middle of Lincoln Middle School's hallway, surrounded by scattered papers and snickering students. His art portfolio lay open on the floor, footprints marking the carefully crafted drawings he'd spent weeks perfecting. Guess your rich friend couldn't buy you coordination, Tommy Martinez called out, high-fiving his friends as they passed. Better stick to cleaning houses like your mom. Jamal knelt to gather his work, his face burning. The whispers had started 2 weeks ago when a local newspaper ran a story about Robert Morrison mentoring underprivileged youth. The photo of them at the community center had turned Jamal into a target. Need help. Marcus appeared beside him, helping collect the drawings. Man, these are really good. That Tommy's just jello. Because his stick figures look like they got run over. It's not about the drawings. Jamal carefully smoothed a crumpled sketch of the Morrison estate gardens, drawn from his mother's descriptions. They think I'm trying to be something I'm not. The boys moved to an empty classroom, where Jamal spread out his damaged artwork on a desk. Most pieces could be salvaged, but his centerpiece, a portrait combining features from the mysterious photograph his mother kept in his own reflection, was torn beyond repair. "Why'd you draw that anyway?" Marcus asked, pointing to the ruined portrait. "You don't even know your dad." Jamal didn't answer immediately. How could he explain the strange feeling he got whenever he visited Robert's office? The way certain gestures or expressions seemed to echo through time, connecting him to something larger than himself. "Mr. Morrison's coming to pick me up," he said instead. "We're setting up the youth art exhibition at his company's gallery." Marcus whistled. "For real? That's major." "But..." He hesitated. "Some kids are saying your mom's using you to get close to him. Like, for money and stuff." The words hit harder than Tommy's bullying. "My mom doesn't even want me spending time with him," Jamal snapped. "She gets weird whenever I mention his name." The classroom door opened, and Robert entered, his usual impeccable suit at odds with the worn school environment. His expression darkened at the sight of Jamal's damaged artwork. "What happened here?" Jamal shrugged, trying to appear unconcerned. "Just an accident." Robert picked up the torn portrait, studying it intently. "This is remarkable work, Jamal. The way you've captured the features, it reminds me of your mother's technique." "It's garbage now." Jamal started shoving papers into his portfolio. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I should stick to what people like me are supposed to do." "People like you?" Robert's voice carried an edge. "And who decides what you're supposed to be?" "Everyone." Jamal burst out. "The kids here, their parents, even my mom sometimes. Nobody believes I can be more than where I came from." Robert sat on the edge of a desk, suddenly looking less like a billionaire CEO and more like someone who understood. "When I was young, my grandfather told me something I never forgot. He said, 'Your origins are not your destination, but they're part of your map.'" He paused, his expression distant. "I never fully understood what he meant until recently." "Was he rich like you?" "No. He worked construction, lived paycheck to paycheck. But he had a vision for his family's future." Robert carefully straightened a corner of the torn portrait. "The same vision I see in your artwork, Jamal. The ability to look beyond what is and see what could be." Jamal studied the damaged portrait. "I tried to draw what I imagine my dad looks like, mixed with my own face. Mom says I have his eyes, but she never shows me pictures." Robert's hand trembled slightly as he set down the drawing. "Art has a way of revealing truth, even when we don't realize it." He stood, straightening his jacket. "Come on. I have something to show you at the gallery." The ride to Morrison Tech was quiet, both lost in thought. In the building's lobby, a space was being transformed. Workers hung track lighting and positioned pedestals while an elegant banner announced, "Future Visions, Young Artists of Webster Community Center." "This isn't charity," Robert said firmly, noting Jamal's hesitation. "This is investment in talent. Your mother taught me that art shows the truth inside people. It's time for others to see that truth too." As they walked through the space, Robert pointed out where each piece would go. Jamal's work would feature prominently, including a special section for his portraits. "People will come here expecting to see children's art," Robert explained. "They'll leave understanding that talent and vision know no boundaries." He paused by an empty wall. "This space is reserved for a special piece, a collaboration between you and your mother. If she agrees." Jamal stared at the wall, imagination already filling the space. "You really think people will care about art from kids like me?" "Kids like you?" Robert's voice was gentle. "You mean talented, persistent, and brave enough to show the world how you see it." He placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "Your grandfather believed in the power of art to transcend boundaries. He fought for that belief." "My grandfather?" Jamal looked up sharply. "I never knew him." Robert seemed to catch himself, removing his hand. "I meant my grandfather. The construction worker who believed in building futures." He checked his watch quickly. "We should get you home. Your mother will worry." As they drove back to Webster Center, Jamal noticed Robert glancing at him in the rearview mirror, his expression troubled. Something had shifted between them, though Jamal couldn't name it. Like the portrait he'd tried to create, there were pieces of a larger picture just beginning to emerge. The Morrison Tech Gallery opening drew an unexpected mix of New York society and Webster Center residents. Crystal champagne flutes clinked alongside paper cups of punch as children in their best clothes guided elegantly dressed patrons through their artwork. Security guards stood discreetly by the doors, a reminder of Alex's insistence on proper precautions. Sarah Washington's contribution dominated one wall, a striking triptych depicting 3 generations of hands, aged and weathered, strong and assured, young and reaching. Visitors congregated before it, murmuring about technique and symbolism, unaware of the artist standing quietly in their midst. "Your mother's piece is causing quite a stir," Robert said, approaching Jamal, who stood proudly by his own display. "Though your portraits are drawing significant attention as well." Jamal beamed, straightening his new suit jacket, a gift from Robert that actually fit. 3 people asked about buying them. "Real collectors," Mom said. Speaking of collectors. Robert gestured toward an elderly woman examining one of Jamal's pieces with intense focus. "That's Victoria Ashworth. She's on the board of the Metropolitan Museum of Art." Before Jamal could respond, Alex appeared, his smile tight and artificial. "Robert, a word." Without waiting for an answer, he gripped his brother's arm and steered him toward a quiet corner. "This has gone far enough," Alex hissed, dropping all pretense of civility. "Do you have any idea what you're risking? The board is already questioning your judgment, and now this circus." Robert calmly removed his brother's hand from his arm. "This circus has attracted major arts patrons and generated more positive press than our last 3 corporate events combined. This isn't about press." Alex's voice rose slightly before he caught himself. "I found the paperwork you requested about Sarah's departure. If you pursue this, everything Father built could collapse." "You mean everything he buried?" Robert's tone hardened. "I know about the trust fund, Alex. The one grandfather established before he died." Alex's face paled. "You can't prove anything." "Can't I?" Sarah's settlement matched the monthly interest from that trust exactly. Father may have hidden the principal, but he couldn't quite bring himself to completely cut off his own. "Stop." Alex grabbed Robert's sleeve, knocking over an empty champagne glass. The crash drew attention, including Jamal's. Across the room, Sarah watched the brothers intently, her hand clutching her pendant, the one she always said was her only inheritance. "Is everything okay over there?" Victoria Ashworth's cultured voice carried across the gallery. "Mr. Morrison, I simply must discuss young Jamal's remarkable eye for genetic traits in his portraits. The familial resemblances he captures are absolutely fascinating." Alex's laugh held an edge of hysteria. "Genetic traits? Oh, that's rich. That's absolutely perfect." He turned to Robert. "You want to tell her about genetic traits? About family resemblances? Go ahead. Destroy everything we've built. Let's see how your precious art program survives when the truth comes out." "The truth about what?" Jamal had approached silently, his young face serious. "Why are you so angry about our art?" "Our art?" Alex rounded on him. "There is no our here, boy. You're a charity case that's outlived its usefulness. This little experiment in social consciousness is over." Robert stepped between them. "That's enough, Alex." "No, it's not nearly enough." Alex's voice rose again. "You think you're honoring grandfather's memory? You're spitting on father's grave. He spent decades building walls between us and them, and you're tearing them down for what? Some vague notion of artistic justice." The gallery had gone silent. Sarah moved through the crowd like a ghost, reaching for her son. But Jamal stood his ground, his eyes fixed on Alex. "The walls were never real," Jamal said quietly. "They're just like art, someone made them up. And just like art, they can be changed." Alex stared at the boy, really looked at him perhaps for the first time. Something flickered in his expression, recognition, fear, fury. "You have no idea what you're talking about. No idea what's at stake." "Then explain it to me," Robert challenged. Explain why father doubled Sarah's payment the day after grandfather changed his will. Explain why that trust fund still exists, generating interest that matches those payments to the penny. Sarah's hand found Jamal's shoulder. "We should go," she whispered. "No." Jamal's voice was firm. "I'm tired of secrets. Of whispers. Of people looking at my paintings and seeing something they won't talk about." Victoria Ashworth had drifted closer, her expert eye moving between the brothers and the boy. "Remarkable," she murmured. "Simply remarkable. The Morrison line has always had such distinctive features. The eyes particularly." "This ends now," Alex declared, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling security. This event is over. If you do that," Robert said with deadly calm, "I'll have PR release grandfather's unredacted will tomorrow morning. Every clause, every provision, every truth he tried to preserve." The brothers stared at each other across years of secrets and lies. In the tense silence, Jamal moved to stand beside his latest portrait, the one that had caused such a stir. In it, 3 generations of men shared the same eyes, a construction worker's determined gaze, a billionaire's troubled vision, and a young artist's hopeful view of the future. The truth hung in the air like brushstrokes on canvas, waiting for someone brave enough to claim it. The aftermath of the gallery confrontation rippled through both families' lives. Robert sat in his penthouse office late that night, the city lights below offering no comfort. On his desk lay 2 photographs, the old image of Sarah in the garden and a newspaper clipping from the exhibition showing Jamal standing proudly by his artwork. The resemblance was no longer something he could ignore. His phone buzzed with another message from Alex: "Board meeting tomorrow. Emergency session. Don't make me do this." In the Webster Center apartment, Jamal sat at his small desk, sketching by lamplight. The piece taking shape under his pencil showed 2 worlds colliding, the Morrison Tech Tower in the community center, connected by a bridge made of paintbrushes and dreams. His mother's voice carried from the kitchen where she spoke in hushed tones on the phone. "You don't understand, Marie. They're asking questions I can't answer. Questions I promised never to answer." Jamal added more detail to the bridge in his drawing, making it stronger, more defined. Each stroke felt like an act of defiance against the walls Alex had talked about. The next morning, Robert faced the Morrison Tech Board of Directors. Alex sat at the opposite end of the table, a thick folder in front of him. "This mentorship program has gone beyond charitable outreach," Alex began. "My brother's involvement with the Washington family has become inappropriate. It risks exposing sensitive family matters that could damage shareholder confidence." "Since when is supporting young artists inappropriate?" Robert countered, his voice steady. "Our grandfather believed in building bridges between communities. Don't." Alex's warning was sharp. "Don't bring him into this." "Why not? His legacy is at the heart of everything happening here." Robert stood, addressing the full board. "Morrison Tech was built on the belief that talent and worth aren't confined to social classes. My grandfather understood that better than anyone. Your grandfather was a sentimental old man who nearly destroyed everything with his misguided notion of justice." Alex slammed his hand on the table. "Father protected us from his mistakes. Protected this company's reputation. Protected lies, you mean?" Robert's quiet words cut through his brother's anger. "Tell them, Alex. Tell them what's really in that folder." In the Webster Center art room, Jamal worked on a new piece while his classmates chatted around him. This portrait was different from his previous attempts, more certain, more truthful. The features came together with supernatural clarity, his own eyes, Robert's jawline, a hint of Alex's frown. Sarah entered the room, freezing when she saw her son's work. "Jamal." "I know, Mom." He didn't look up from his drawing. "I've always known, somehow. It's in every picture I draw, every time I try to capture who I am." Back in the Morrison Tech boardroom, Alex's hand shook as he opened the folder. "Robert, please. Think about what this will do to us. To our name. Our name." Robert laughed without humor. "Our name belongs to more people than Father wanted to admit. It's time we honored that truth." His phone chimed with a text from Jamal: "I finished the portrait. The real one. The true one." Robert stared at the message, feeling the weight of generations of secrets pressing down on him. He thought of his grandfather, the construction worker who built an empire but never forgot his values. Thought of Sarah in the garden, young and full of dreams. Thought of Jamal, bridging worlds with his art. Our grandfather, he told the board, left specific provisions in his will. Provisions my father buried because they didn't fit his vision of our family's future. He met Alex's desperate gaze. But the future isn't something we can control through secrets and settlements. It finds its own way to the truth. The boy's talents are remarkable, one board member offered cautiously. His work at the exhibition showed exceptional promise. His talent isn't the issue, Alex snapped. The issue is what his existence represents. His existence, Robert said quietly, represents everything our grandfather believed in. Everything Morrison Tech claims to stand for. Innovation. Breaking barriers. Recognizing value wherever it appears. As if on cue, his phone lit up with a photo from Jamal, the completed portrait. The board members who could see Robert's screen fell silent, understanding dawning in their expressions. In the community center, Jamal added the final touches to his work. I always thought art was about creating things, he told his mother. But sometimes it's about revealing what's already there. Sarah touched the pendant at her throat, the one she'd kept all these years. Inside was a small key, a key to a safe deposit box she'd never opened. Some truths, she whispered, wait for the right moment to be seen. Robert stood in the boardroom, his decision made. My grandfather believed family was more than blood, it was truth, honor, and the courage to break down walls. He faced his brother. I'm done hiding his truth, Alex. Done pretending we're something we're not. The portrait on his phone screen told the story no one could deny any longer. 3 generations of Morrison men, their features blending seamlessly into a single truth, captured through the eyes of a young artist who bridged 2 worlds without even knowing it. The Morrison family estate stood silent in the late afternoon light, its manicured gardens holding decades of secrets. Robert followed the elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, through familiar corridors to his mother's old study. She'd passed away 3 years ago, but the room remained untouched, preserved like a museum to unspoken histories. Your mother spent her last days in here, Mrs. Chen said, unlocking the heavy oak door. Writing in that leather book of hers. She made me promise to tell you about it, when the time was right. How would you know when the time was right? The housekeeper's weathered face creased with a knowing smile. She said I'd know when you started asking questions about Sarah Washington, and the summer everything changed. The study smelled of leather and old paper. Mrs. Chen crossed to a hidden panel behind the desk, her fingers finding the release mechanism with practiced ease. Inside lay a small safe and a leather-bound diary. Your mother's last gift, she said softly. And perhaps her hardest confession. Robert sat at the desk, the diary heavy in his hands. His mother's elegant script filled pages with truths she'd never spoken aloud. As he read, the past reassembled itself like pieces of a shattered mirror. My dear son, the first entry began, by the time you read this, you'll have met him. The boy with your father's eyes and your grandfather's spirit. The truth we buried beneath layers of pride and fear. The diary revealed a complex web of relationships and decisions. His grandfather, the former construction worker turned business pioneer, had recognized something in Sarah Washington beyond her artistic talent. He'd seen the same hunger for creation, the same dedication to craft that had driven him from work sites to boardrooms. Father was furious when grandfather took such interest in Sarah, Robert read aloud. He saw it as a betrayal of everything he'd built, every social connection he'd cultivated. But grandfather saw something else, a bridge between worlds he thought could heal old wounds. The pages turned, revealing more, Sarah's growing closeness to the family, especially to Robert's younger cousin James, who spent that summer at the estate before his tragic accident. The diary spoke of quiet meetings in the garden, of shared dreams and forbidden love. When Sarah told James about the baby, he was overjoyed, the diary continued. They planned to marry, despite the family's objections. Your grandfather supported them, even began changing his will to ensure their child would have his rightful place in the family. Robert's hands trembled as he turned the page. But then the accident happened. James was gone, and Sarah was alone, carrying the next generation of Morrisons in a world determined to deny their existence. Mrs. Chen placed a cup of tea beside him. Your father thought he was protecting the family name, she said quietly. But your grandfather knew the true cost of such protection. The diary's next entries detailed frantic meetings, legal documents, and finally, the settlement that would ensure Sarah's silence. But Grandfather Morrison had made his own plans. The trust fund was only part of it, Robert realized, reading further. Grandfather changed his will, not just to provide for Sarah and her child, but to ensure the truth would eventually come out. He knew someone would finally ask the right questions. A photograph slipped from between the pages, Sarah in the garden, young and radiant, standing beside James. Their resemblance to Jamal was startling, undeniable. Robert's phone buzzed. A message from Alex, father's old lawyer, called. Says he has to execute the final provisions of Grandfather's will. Something about a 30Y. Ear clause triggering next month. The diary's final pages held his mother's last confession. I watched you with Sarah's boy at the charity gala, saw how you recognized something in him without knowing why. Your grandfather would be proud. He always said art had a way of revealing truth, of building bridges across the chasms we create. The time for walls is over, Robert. Your nephew deserves to know his heritage, his true place in our family. Mrs. Chin touched his shoulder gently. There's more, she said, reaching for the safe. Your grandfather left something for this moment. Inside lay another envelope, sealed with the Morrison family crest, addressed to my true heir in Grandfather Morrison's bold hand. Robert recognized it as the envelope Sarah had mentioned, the one she'd left behind all those years ago. As he broke the seal, a key fell into his palm, along with a letter that began, to my great-grandson, when the time comes for truth to triumph over pride. The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted his reading. Through the study window, he saw Sarah's modest sedan parking beside his Tesla. She stepped out, holding a familiar pendant, the one she always wore. In the fading light, he could see Jamal in the passenger seat, clutching his latest portrait. The past and present were about to collide, and no amount of wealth or social standing could stop the truth from emerging. Robert tucked the letter into his pocket, the key a heavy weight beside it. The time for secrets was over. The Morrison estate's grand sitting room had hosted countless social events, but never a confrontation quite like this. Alex burst through the doors, waving a stack of papers, his composed exterior finally cracking. You've gone too far. He threw the papers onto the antique coffee table. I just got word from legal. Someone leaked Grandfather's unredacted will to the press. It's everywhere, social media, news sites, even the board members are talking. Robert stood by the fireplace, his mother's diary in one hand, Grandfather's letter in the other. Sarah and Jamal sat on the Victorian sofa, the pendant with its key laid carefully between them. Mrs. Chin stood guard by the door, a silent witness to history unfolding. I didn't leak anything, Robert said quietly. Though perhaps it's better this way. No more controlled narratives, no more careful PR spins. Better. Alex's laugh held a note of hysteria. The stock is already dropping. Our father's oldest friends are calling, demanding explanations. Do you have any idea what this will do to us? To us. Sarah's voice cut through the tension. You've had 30 years to worry about us, Alex. 30 years while my son, your nephew, grew up without knowing his true heritage. Jamal picked up the pendant, studying it in the fading sunlight. Mom always said this was her only inheritance. But that wasn't true, was it? No, Robert answered, moving to sit across from them. Your grandfather Morrison left much more. A trust fund, properties, and most importantly, the truth about your father, James Morrison. James was our cousin, Alex interjected. The family's golden boy. Until he fell in love with the help and ruined everything. He didn't ruin anything, Sarah snapped. Your father did that when he forced us apart, when he made me choose between my baby's future and the family's precious reputation. Jamal stood suddenly, moving to the grand mirror above the fireplace. His reflection mingled with the family portraits on the wall, generations of Morrison men with the same determined set to their jaw, the same penetrating gaze. The paintings, he said softly. Every time I tried to capture my father's face, I was really remembering these. I've been drawing my own history without knowing it. The sound of car doors slamming interrupted the moment. Through the window, they could see news vans gathering at the estate's gates. Vultures, Alex muttered. Here to feast on our disgrace. No, Robert countered. Here to witness our redemption. He held up the diary. Mother knew this day would come. She spent her final years documenting everything: the love between James and Sarah, father's intervention, grandfather's attempts to make things right. And this. Jamal held up the pendant's key. What truth does this unlock? Sarah reached for her son's hand. Your grandfather Morrison gave me that key the day before I left. Said it opened a safety deposit box at First Manhattan Bank. I never had the courage to look inside. Because you knew it would change everything, Alex said, his anger deflating into resignation. Just like James knew. Just like father knew. Robert's phone buzzed continuously with notifications as the story spread. Headlines flashed across his screen: Morrison tech heir hidden for decades, family secret rocks New York society, art prodigy revealed as missing Morrison. We can't hide from this anymore, Robert said, facing his brother. Grandfather knew that someday, talent and truth would triumph over prejudice and pride. That's why he changed his will, why he left provisions that would activate after 30 years. The exhibition, Jamal realized. All those portraits I painted, trying to understand who I am. They were like pieces of a map leading here. Sarah touched the diary in Robert's hands. James used to say that love was stronger than social boundaries. That art could bridge any divide. He was a romantic fool, Alex muttered. He was right, Robert countered. Look at Jamal's work. Look at how naturally he captured the Morrison features, the family spirit. Art revealed what we tried so hard to conceal. Through the windows, camera flashes punctuated the gathering dusk. The world waited to hear the truth about the Morrison heir who grew up in Webster Center, who discovered his heritage through art and courage. Alex moved to the liquor cabinet, pouring himself a drink with shaking hands. So this is it. 30 years of careful management undone by a boy with a paintbrush. No, Jamal said, his voice stronger now. Undone by the truth. The same truth I've been painting all along. He reached into his portfolio, withdrawing his latest work, a portrait that captured 3 generations of Morrisons, their features blending seamlessly into his own. The painting seemed to pulse with life in the dimming room, telling a story that no amount of money or social pressure could suppress any longer. The walls between worlds were crumbling, and through the gaps shone a new kind of light, the light of recognition, of acceptance, of family redefined. Robert stood, facing the growing media presence outside. It's time, he said simply. Time to show the world what family really means. The key in Jamal's hand gleamed like a promise, waiting to unlock the final pieces of their shared story. The First Manhattan Bank's private vault room felt like a time capsule. Robert, Sarah, and Jamal stood before the safety deposit box while Alex waited by the door, his presence both reluctant and necessary. The key from Sarah's pendant fit perfectly into the lock. Inside lay an envelope, thick with documents, and a small recorder, the kind used for dictation 30 years ago. Grandfather Morrison's voice, preserved through decades of silence, filled the room. To my great-grandson, and to the family I hope will finally be united when you hear this. If you're listening, then art has done what I always believed it could, revealed truth through beauty, connected hearts through creativity. Jamal gripped his mother's hand as the voice continued, telling a story of love that defied social boundaries, of a young artist who captured not just images but souls on canvas, of a son, James, who dared to challenge his world's prejudices. The papers in this box, the recording continued, establish a trust in your name, but more importantly, they contain letters from your father. James knew the risks he faced challenging the family's expectations. He wrote to you, my great-grandson, every day after learning of your existence. Sarah's quiet sobs echoed in the vault as Jamal opened the first letter. James Morrison's handwriting flowed across the page, to my child, who I may never meet but will always love. Your mother's art showed me that true beauty knows no boundaries. I hope you inherit her gift for seeing beyond surfaces, for capturing truth in unexpected places. Outside the bank, reporters gathered, but for once, Alex made no move to manage the situation. He stood, watching his nephew read his father's words, seeing James in every expression that crossed the boy's face. The final provision of my will, Grandfather Morrison's voice continued, activates today. The Morrison Art Foundation will be established, dedicated to fostering young talent from all backgrounds. And its first exhibition will feature a permanent installation, Sarah's portrait of James, paired with whatever art our future heir creates. For I believe that talent flows through generations, finding its own path despite the obstacles we place in its way. Robert withdrew a folded document from the envelope. It's the original garden portrait, he said softly. The one Sarah painted of James that summer. Father thought he'd destroyed it. The painting showed a young man in the Morrison garden, his face turned slightly away but his spirit radiating from every brush stroke. Next to it lay a blank canvas, labeled simply, "For the next generation." "I know what belongs there," Jamal said, reaching for his portfolio. He withdrew his latest work, the portrait that had caused such a stir at the gallery. But now he added something new, painting directly on the aged canvas beside his father's image, connecting past and present with bold, confident strokes. Hours later, they stood in the Morrison Tech Gallery. The media had been invited in, but this moment belonged to the family first. Jamal's merged portrait held the center wall, James and his son, their features mirrored across time, connected by art and blood and truth finally spoken. Alex approached the painting slowly. "He has father's stubbornness," he said quietly. "But James's heart. And grandfather's vision. He has his own spirit," Sarah corrected gently. "Everything else is just inheritance." Robert addressed the waiting reporters, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "The Morrison family has always believed in building futures. My grandfather built this company from construction sites and dreams. My cousin James dared to build bridges across social divides. And my nephew, Jamal Morrison Washington, builds connections through art that transcend all boundaries." The doors opened to the public, and two worlds flowed together, Webster Center residents mingling with Manhattan's elite, drawn together by the power of Jamal's vision. The boy who once crashed a charity gala now stood proudly beside his latest work, his mother's hand on one shoulder, his uncle's flanking him with newfound pride. "Art reveals truth," Jamal told the cameras, echoing words from long ago. "But family is the canvas we painted on." In the garden portrait, James seemed to smile, his features caught in eternal youth, while beside him, his son's self-portrait looked toward a future where walls crumbled before the power of talent and truth. Between them, painted in colors that bridged decades of separation, ran a simple quote from Grandfather Morrison's last letter: "Love builds better bridges than fortune ever could." The Morrison Tech building blazed with light against the night sky, its windows reflecting the gathered crowd, a family redefined, a legacy renewed, and a young artist standing at the crossroads of past and future, his brush ready to paint whatever truth came next. Sarah touched her pendant, now empty of its secret but full of fulfilled promise. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered to Jamal. "He knows," Jamal replied, adding one final stroke to the merged portrait. "He's been watching through every portrait I've ever painted. Art has a way of keeping love alive." Robert raised his glass to the gathered crowd. "To family," he said simply. "In all its forms, through all its changes, across all its bridges." "To family," they echoed, and in the portrait, past and present seemed to merge into a single moment of perfect understanding, the moment when art finally revealed the truth that love had known all along.